All right, so Afghanistan's role in modern conflicts. So, like I said, we're going to be talking about the war in Afghanistan and Afghanistan's role in the larger issue of kind of modern terrorism. So, here we go. All right, I'll give you a second. All right, so for starters, here, the Soviet Afghan War is probably the most important war that you don't know about. Okay, so that's going to change today. This war is super important for a number of reasons. First, it's a pivotal Cold War event because um, essentially the USSR tries to invade Afghanistan in order to turn it communist, which is nothing new. The conflict between communism and kind of vulnerable nations in this part of the world is nothing new, and it's part of the Cold War. And we know that the Russians are moving in a lot of different places and trying to impose their economic system um, on these places to turn the world communism. And the war in Afghanistan is just another chapter in that story. But it's also really, really important to understand the Soviet Afghan War as it relates to Middle Eastern based extremism. Let's say that. So in 1979, 1980, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan for the purposes of turning it into a communist nation. Okay, terrific. Well, the United States at the time during the Cold War, we know, sworn enemy of the Soviet Union, they're going to support and supply the opposition to the Russians. Okay. And this is nothing new. We've seen this behavior in Korea. We've seen this behavior in Vietnam. We've seen this behavior in, Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba also, right? So anti-communist forces that want to stand up to communism, the United States loves backing and supporting these places and these people because after all, the Cold War from the United States perspective is all about containment. So anytime we can kind of ally ourselves with the opposition to communism, we tend to do that. And the Soviet Afghan War is no exception. So when the Russians invade Afghanistan, the United States supports and supplies Afghanistan against the Russians. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. Now, we don't know it at the time, but the group that's in charge of Afghanistan, the Taliban, is going to eventually evolve into one of the United States' largest enemies. But at the time, we don't know that, so we back them against the Soviet Union. Now, when the USSR invades Afghanistan, the Afghans see this whole thing not from a kind of economic/political agenda that the Cold War was about for the rest of the world. They see this as more of like a religious issue. So from their perspective, the Soviet Union invading Afghanistan is like the modern world coming to Afghanistan in order to erase Islamic culture. And that's the way they see it. So while the rest of the world views this incident as kind of a socio-political kind of Cold War event, the Afghan perspective is that this is an entirely religious event. So it takes on a different meaning for them than it does for the rest of the world. And the way they view the conflict has profound impacts on the way they respond to it. I'll give you a second. All right. So, because Afghanistan views this as a religious issue, they can kind of rally the support of everyone in that religion. So, this becomes an Islam versus the world kind of situation. So, regardless of the country that you live in, if you were Muslim, you kind of sympathize with this event. So, this becomes a hotbed for what's called mujahideen, which is loosely translated to in Arabic to kind of holy warrior. And basically, what the story is here is these Muslim holy warriors, the Mujahideen, gathered together in Afghanistan to band together and fight off non-Muslim invading forces. So this becomes kind of jihad, and we will kind of go over what that means. But it essentially amounts to holy war. So, regardless of your national allegiances or anything like that, this is really about Muslims versus the world. So, they come from Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, North Africa, Syria, Jordan, Egypt. It doesn't matter, wherever, Pakistan, everywhere. Okay, Muslims come from all over the world, geographically close to there at least, all over the region to join in Afghanistan and fight off these Western invaders, as they'll call them. So eventually, through the use of guerrilla tactics, they kind of drag this conflict out for a long period of time, and it becomes kind of a waiting game and kind of a war of attrition, and eventually the Soviets just pack up and leave. Starts in 1979, so 10 years later, you're pushing right up against the kind of the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. So needless to say, by the end of 10 years, the Soviet Union has bigger issues than a war in far-off Afghanistan. So they eventually pack up and leave. Ever since this event, the Taliban, the government of Afghanistan, has been sympathetic to Muslim holy warriors. So this kind of lays the groundwork for everything else that we're going to talk about as far as the modern Afghanistan and its role in modern terrorism and supporting bin Laden and Al Qaeda and the people that perpetrate 9/11. So you can't understand Afghanistan's role in these modern events without understanding Afghanistan's role in this particular event that preceded it. Okay, so it's important to understand the backstory so that we lay the foundation for kind of what's going on in general presently, or at least comparatively more recently than 1979 or whatever. So that's the deal. All right, last slide. I'll give you a second. So as the story goes, Osama bin Laden, which is a name that I'm sure you guys are familiar with at this point, but Osama bin Laden is one of these mujahideen that flocked to Afghanistan during the Soviet-Afghan War, and there he remains. He kind of floats around afterwards, but he eventually returns back to Afghanistan because they are basically the only country that will shelter him. It is from Afghanistan that bin Laden, along with his co-conspirators as part of the Al Qaeda terror network, orchestrate the 9/11 terror attacks in America. The Taliban government, like we said, has a history of kind of providing shelter and refuge for what's called holy warriors. And this goes all the way back to what we were just talking about, that Soviet-Afghan conflict. So they are kind of harboring a fugitive, according to the U.S., which, under American law, we have similar laws like that. Like someone who's committed a crime, like you by law have to turn them over to the police, or else you become an accomplice after the fact. You can get charged for that. And in international kind of way, they're kind of imposing the same sensibilities here. Basically that Osama bin Laden and Al Qaeda perpetrated a deadly terrorist attack that resulted in the deaths of several thousand people in America, and the Taliban government is sheltering and supporting these known terrorists. Therefore, they are responsible for these attacks the same way that Al Qaeda is. We gave them opportunity to turn them over. They did not. So we go to war with Afghanistan. And the reasoning is supporting and sheltering these terrorists is the same thing as committing those acts of terrorism yourself. And that's the logic that the United States applies to this. And this is the reason behind going to war in Afghanistan. So for the classwork, you're going to take a look at a couple different things. You're going to look at the life of Osama bin Laden, kind of biographically, where he comes from and kind of his background a little